Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture we're going to learn how to create the kitchen objects like the various ingredients. Okay, so far we have our player, we can walk around, I can approach each of these counters, and I can interact with it. Now the next goal is to create objects the player can pick up and drop when interacting with a clear counter. So let's begin by making the actual objects. So let's create a new empty game object, call this one the tomato. Then again, as usual, let's separate the visual. So in the included assets, let's go inside of it. Then we've got the prefab visuals and we've got the kitchen objects visuals. And inside we've got all of the ingredients. So let's just find the tomato visual and drag it as a child of the tomato. And again, as usual, make sure to put on position, local position 000. And for the main one, let's put it on a Y of 0 and just push it a little bit off to the side just so we can see. Okay, great. Now this one is obviously not going to exist over here in our world. Instead, we're going to spawn it. So let's make it a prefab. Let's just drag it over here into our prefabs. Okay, there it is. Let's delete it from our scene. And actually on our prefabs, let's make a nice folder to keep things nicely separated. So inside the prefabs, let's make a subfolder. Call it the kitchen objects. Let's put the tomato inside of it. And let's also make another folder for the counters. And let's put the clear counter inside of it. Okay, so everything is nicely organized. All right. Now that we have this, let's go inside our clear counter script. And over here, let's add a simple reference to our prefab. So let's make of type transform, call it the tomato prefab. By the way, here you could make this prefab reference of type game object. Which type you use in this scenario is pretty interchangeable. I talked about those differences in another video. So when using prefabs, using them as transforms or game objects, that's pretty much personal preference. And personally, I just prefer to use them as transforms. Okay, so we have this. Let's just make this a serialized field so we can set it in the editor. And over here in the editor, let's open up, go inside the counter prefab and just drag the tomato reference. Okay, great. Let's go back outside, save. Now back in the code here, when the player interacts with it, let's just spawn it. So let's call instantiate, pass in the tomato prefab. And now here is a good question, which is where exactly do we spawn this? We don't want to spawn on this counter's origin. Remember that the counter, the way we set it up, the origin on the actual object is over there on the bottom. We don't want to spawn the tomato inside the mesh. That would not make sense. Instead, what we want is to spawn up here. So the next question is, okay, so how do we get this point on top of the counter? One approach would be to use a vector3 directly in the code. That would work, but not very usable. So a more designer-friendly method is to simply use an empty game object as a target. So on the counter, let's first go inside our prefab. And over here, let's create an empty game object inside of it. Let's call this the counter top point. Let's make sure to leave this one as empty, so no components, just a transform. And now let's just position it, so let's lift it up by just about enough, so let's make sure we see. So there you go, just about that. So let's put it on position, a Y of 1.3. Alright, so this point is going to be our spawn point. Let's make sure to save the prefab. Then back in the code here, let's add a reference to our point. And for reference, let's also use a transform reference. Call it the countertop point. Okay, now let's just comment this line just so the code compiles so we can drag the reference. Back in the editor, inside the prefab, let's just drag the countertop point reference. Okay, great. So now here, when we call instantiate, let's instantiate it inside the countertop point. So this will spawn the object, so let's say the transform for the tomato transform. And then we go inside this one, and let's just make sure we position it correctly. So let's put it on a local position of vector3.0. So this will put the object exactly on top of our countertop point. Also here, very important, don't make a mistake. Make sure you're modifying the local position and not the global position. Okay, so with this, let's test. Over here in the editor, let's go back, save our prefab, and hit on play. So here we are, let's approach the counter and interact with it. And yep, there you go, it does work. The tomato was indeed spawned. All right, awesome. Okay, so with this, we have pretty much our basics working. We can move up to a counter, we can interact with it and spawn an object. But now let's say that we want to spawn a different object. So let's say now we want to spawn some cheese. First of all, let's make the actual object. So on the tomato, let's press Ctrl D to duplicate this one. Let's rename this to the cheese block and let's go inside of it. Now in here, instead of the tomato visual, let's drag, here it is, the cheese block visual. So let's use this one instead. Okay, there's our nice visual. Let's make sure to save the prefab and go back out. And now let's say that we want this one to spawn a tomato and this one on the left to spawn some cheese. So let's override the prefab and over here drag the cheese block. And now if we hit on play, can go up to this one and yep, there's a tomato, go up to this one and yep, there's some cheese. Okay, so it all looks great. But now let's say we want to know what object we just spawned. Like what object is on top of this spawn transform. Just like this in the code, all we have is a transform reference. So with this, the only way to know what type we spawned would be if we had different prefabs for every single object. Then we could compare them one by one and see which one this matches. But then let's say, what if we wanted an actual string for the object? Well, then we would need to add tons of fields for all of these strings for all of the objects. Then what about an icon for each type? Once again, we would need tons of fields, each one for each icon. But if we did it just like that with a bunch of lists, then they would be separated. That's not very good. We should have a proper way of defining our object types and all the data related to them. So this is exactly where scriptable objects come in. These are objects you can create in your project files, which are perfect for anything where you have multiple instances of a type. Like for example, multiple weapons, multiple armors, multiple recipes, or maybe multiple ingredients. As usual, I have a dedicated video on scriptable objects. They are super useful, definitely watch that for more detail. Over here, let's just use them. So the first thing we're going to need is to actually define the type, and we do that in a C# script. So in our scripts folder, let's create a new C# script. Call this the kitchen object SO. Now personally, SO is just what I like to append to my scriptable object definitions, just to make it very clear that it's a scriptable object. However, this is not a requirement, it's just a naming rule that I like to follow. And we're calling this kitchen object because we're going to use this to define any kitchen object we want to interact with. So that's going to be our ingredients, like for example the tomato and cheese, but also things like a plate, and then potentially you could implement things like a frying pan or frying extinguisher or anything like that. So this is going to represent any kind of kitchen object the player can interact with. Okay, so let's make the script, and now let's open it. And over here, okay, first things first is this is not a mono behavior. Instead, let's extend scriptable object, and then technically you can have functions inside a scriptable object, but for now let's just get rid of this, so just an empty class. And over here, let's just place whatever fields we need to store whatever data we want. So like I said, first we want a prefab, so let's make a public transform for our prefab. By the way, here note how I am indeed using public. This is pretty much the one exception to the rule. I only use scriptable objects as read-only data containers, I never write to them. So since I follow that rule, I usually make the fields in the scriptable object public. That way I can access them directly without having to make a public getter. But if you want, do feel free to keep following the general rule of not making anything public. You could definitely make this just a regular serialized field and expose with a get function, that would work. Personally, I just find it simpler to make it public, since I know that as a personal rule I will never write to a scriptable object field. Okay, so we have a transform for our prefab. Let's also add a sprite for the icon sprite. And finally, let's just add a simple string for the object name. Alright, so we have our scriptable object definition. We have all of the fields for all of the data we want to store. Now, how do we actually create a scriptable object? For that, let's go up here before the class name, and we're going to add the attribute, so let's add the square brackets. And the attribute is the create asset menu. This takes some optional parameters. Again, I cover them in detail in the dedicated scriptable objects video. For now, let's just leave all the parameters as empty, just use defaults and close the attribute. Okay, so that's it. Let's save this and go back into the editor. And over here, if we go into the project window, click on the plus icon, and right up top, yep, we do see a kitchen object SO. So if we select it, yep, there you go, it creates a brand new object inside of our project files. Let's name this one tomato. And obviously, let's keep our project nice and organized, so we don't want this inside the scripts folder. Instead, let's make a proper folder, so create a new folder, call it our scriptable objects. And then inside, let's put a different folder for each type. So let's make another subfolder, call it the kitchen object SO, and let's place the tomato inside of it. Okay. Now with the tomato selected, we can look in the inspector, and we can see, yep, it does have all of the fields that we define. Okay, great. So now we can just assign them. So this is the tomato, so let's drag the tomato prefab. For the icon sprite, let's find it. So there are sprites included in the regular assets, so here is the tomato sprite. So it's inside the assets, then inside textures, icons, and we have all the icons. And finally, for the readable name, let's just call it tomato. Alright, so that's it. Here we have a really nice scriptable object containing all the data required for our tomato. Okay, awesome. With that then, we can now go back into our clear counter script. And here, instead of entering a field for our tomato prefab, instead of this, let's store a reference of type kitchen object SO, and let's call it kitchen object SO. And then when spawning, let's go inside our scriptable object and just spawn the prefab reference. So this is going to be the kitchen object transform. Then over here in the editor, let's go inside the clear counter and let's assign the tomato kitchen object. Okay, so let's save it and test. So here we are, let's approach, hit, and yep, there you go, it still spawns the tomato. Okay, great. Now let's make another type for our cheese block. So let's create a brand new kitchen object SO, call it the cheese block. And again, let's assign, first of all, the prefab, there it is. Then for the sprite of the cheese block, and finally, this is the cheese block. Okay, so now, for example, let's go into the second one. And on the second counter, let's override and say this one spawn a cheese block. So let's test. So here we are, approach this one. Yep, there's a tomato, this one, and yep, there's some cheese. Okay, great. So everything is working so far. However, the original problem that we're trying to solve, identifying the spawn prefab, we still don't have a solution for that. Basically, when we spawn a prefab, we need to know from which scriptable object this prefab came from. So essentially, what I like to do is just attach some reference to the scriptable object in our prefab. However, again, remember that scriptable objects are not mono behaviors. So if I select the prefab and I try dragging the scriptable object, nope, it does not work. So what we can do is just create a new script. So let's make a brand new C# script. Let's call it kitchen object. Let's attach this to both prefabs, so both the cheese and the block, attach the same one to both of them, and let's open. And over here, very simple, let's just add a serialized field for our kitchen object. So a serialized field of type kitchen object SO for the kitchen object SO. Then let's also make a quick function to expose it. So we're going to return kitchen object SO, get kitchen object SO, and we just return the kitchen object SO. Yep, just like this. So now here in the editor for the tomato, yep, we've got the field. So let's say this one is a tomato, and the cheese block, this one is a cheese block. Now here, obviously, we need to make very sure to drag the correct reference to the right scriptable object. If you drag the wrong one, like for example over here on cheese, you would say this one is a tomato. If you did that, then obviously you would get some very weird results. So make sure to check and double check that you drag the right references. Both over here on the prefabs, make sure they are referencing the correct scriptable object. And on the scriptable object itself, make sure they are referencing the correct prefab. Okay, so now if you go here on the clear counter, we spawn our object. Okay, great. Then on this object, we can do get component of type kitchen object, and then we can just ask it to give us the kitchen object SO. So for example, let's do a debug.log on this one. So inside, get the kitchen object SO, and then let's print out the object name. All right, so here we are. Let's interact with this one. And yep, there you go, interacted and spawned a tomato. And on this one, yep, interacted and spawned a cheese block. Okay, awesome. We spawned a transform prefab, and we identified the spawned object is indeed this type of object. Alright, so here we'll learn about one of the most powerful Unity features, scriptable objects. These are extremely useful for defining a type and then creating multiple instances of that type with whatever data we want. So that can be some ingredients like we have here, or it could be some weapons, could even be some NPC data, maybe some quest data, and so on. It really is an insanely very useful feature. Definitely go ahead and watch a dedicated video on scriptable objects. Then if you want, you can also watch some more videos where I've used scriptable objects. For example, the Minecraft crafting system using scriptable objects, or the hydrogenated crafting system, which again also uses scriptable objects. Okay, so this is done, it's working great. Now let's continue to the next lecture, where we're going to help the kitchen object know where it belongs and help each counter know what kitchen object is on top of it.